In 326 BCE, the Macedonian army began their descent through the Hindu Kush. They were moving into a territory that challenged the geographic scale of everything they had encountered in the Mediterranean world. Alexander was barely 30 years old, yet he was undefeated. He had already absorbed the Greek city-states, the Egyptian priesthoods, and the vast administrative machinery of the Persian Empire. India was a patchwork of regional powers rather than a single empire. These kingdoms guarded their borders with specialized military technology, the war elephant, a weapon the Greeks were largely unprepared to counter. The reputation of the Macedonian phalanx was often enough to secure victory without a fight. King Ampi of Taxila, recognizing the incoming threat, surrendered his city and offered horses and supplies to secure an alliance. Alexander had mastered the art of defeating human enemies, but he was now approaching a frontier where geography and psychology would form a front he couldn't break with a sword. The flooded Jhelum River became a tactical barrier. Porus trapped the Macedonians on the eastern bank. Leaving a decoy force in plain sight, Alexander moved his elite units 17 miles upstream under cover of a thunderstorm, crossing in secret. When the two armies finally met at dawn, the disciplined Greek ranks faced the shock of a massive elephant charge. The animals trampled the phalanx, turning the structured battlefield into a chaotic struggle for survival. The Macedonian cavalry was neutralized. The horses, terrified by the scent and the roaring of the elephants, refused to charge, forcing the Greeks into a slow, high-casualty infantry slog. Alexander eventually managed to outflank the Indian lines. Porus fought until he was severely wounded and captured, earning such respect from Alexander that he was allowed to keep his kingdom as a regional governor. While the Greeks held the field, the victory was costly. The intensity of the combat and the high number of casualties began to erode the army's confidence in their own invincibility. Alexander intended to push further east toward the Ganges. However, reports reached the camp of even larger armies waiting in the interior, allegedly supported by thousands of additional war elephants. Morale in the camp evaporated. The men had been away from their families for years, and the prospect of fighting a seemingly endless series of increasingly difficult battles created a state of near mutiny. General Conus eventually spoke for the troops. He argued that the men were physically and mentally exhausted, and that their loyalty did not change the fact that they were no longer capable of a sustained offensive. Alexander retreated to his tent in frustration for 3 days. When he emerged, he finally accepted the reality. A leader cannot continue a conquest if his army refuses to follow. A leader can command his men to march, but once the collective belief in the mission disappears, the campaign effectively ends. The advance was halted, not by a wall of soldiers, but by a simple refusal to go any further. The retreat south through the Gedrosian Desert proved more lethal than any battle. The army faced miles of scorching sand, a lack of potable water, and extreme temperature shifts that decimated their remaining ranks. Alexander was already physically compromised. He had taken a deep arrow wound to the chest during a siege earlier in the march, an injury that left him vulnerable to the harsh desert environment. In the middle of this wasteland, a small scouting party found a few drops of water in a gully. They brought it to Alexander in a helmet, offering it as a gesture of desperation for their king. Alexander looked at his thirsty soldiers and poured the precious water out into the sand. He chose to share the physical suffering of his men, rather than accept a relief they could not have. The desert journey destroyed the army's remaining strength. Environmental attrition proved to be a far more persistent enemy than any rival king. The survivors eventually reached Babylon. The army that had once seemed unstoppable was now a tired, reduced force occupying the ancient capital. At 32, Alexander met a final, inescapable obstacle. A sudden fever took hold of him, and his health deteriorated so rapidly that within days, the man who had reshaped the map of the world was bedridden. His generals gathered by his bed in silence. He was unable to speak or issue any final orders, a stark contrast to the commander who had led his men across 3 continents. When he died, he transitioned from a living ruler into a symbol. His image was minted onto coins across the Mediterranean, his identity becoming the standard for imperial power for centuries to come. Alexander dismantled every empire he faced. Yet his progress was ultimately stalled by the reach of the desert, the exhaustion of his men, and finally, a fever that no physician could cure.